I'm greatly honored and pleased to be with you today for a variety of reasons. I think, of course, Saraswati Puja, for me as an academician and a retired professor, as the goddess of wisdom and learning, has a special meaning, of course. But also the topic of the charity that we are celebrating today, or for which we are hopefully gaining support today, the life of girl children, is, I think, of course, for me as a woman also very important. If we look at the demographic situation, that normally you have a very slight excess of male births over female birth, which would be maybe 4,000 girls, there would be about 1,036, 1,040 boys born normally. And if we look at some parts of the world, also some parts of India, I have to say regretfully, where you have, say, 100 boys and 80 girls born, that certainly is not a very normal development. And of course we all know that such a statistical outcome is of course caused by the fact that not only do you have abortions of girl babies, but you also have killing of girl babies. And evidently it's not very difficult to kill a baby, but it is very unfortunate and it's very sad. It's a matter also of human dignity, not to stand for such a thing, to try to work against it. And apart from the moral side, it's also a very impractical side that we should have such a thing, particularly in China, I think, where this is also extremely the case because of the extreme one-child policy which they tried to enforce, one should say. Today there's an excess of men, and they don't find enough wives to have, and then they try to sort of their wives from Taiwan or other places. So I think the life of girl children should be just as precious to us as the life of any child at all, and I think it is a very worthy effort that this organization is undertaking here. I'm very pleased to be with you also because in a way the audience here, and particularly also the Indian community, is of course an example of cross-cultural relations, of international relations, and in the way, of course, my own life is that very much too, because I'm of course of two parents as well. My mother was Austrian, or when I was born she was German for historical reasons, and my father was Indian. And I've lived in the United States. I have 3 children. One was born in Germany, 2 were born in the United States. I have one daughter now, one of these 3, who lives in South Africa. I have a granddaughter, or a quasi-granddaughter, who is half Nigerian, so we are an international family, and we believe in the fact that cross-cultural relations are a benefit and enrich people as a whole. Now, of course, you would like to have me say something about my father. That's why you have invited me to. And I think I want to also say something about him in this cross-cultural or migratory perspective that was in his life. Of all the major Indian leaders, he was probably one of those who was most internationally oriented, in the sense that he lived in different countries over time and had different relations. Now, if we compare that to many of you, there is a similarity and there are also differences in his going abroad and living in another country. Most of you, I imagine, are here, have been here for many years, have settled here, and in a way have become Germans as well as they are Indians. And others, of course, are here for studies and different other reasons. And the way my father had in his life different reasons to go abroad. Different roles that he played going abroad. Of course, the first stay abroad was as a student in England, And as a student, as an Indian student in England, he had his own experiences. He once said he enjoyed it rather that he found white people having to brush his shoes, which was not the case in India normally. He was in India as an Indian, also because he studied for the Indian Civil Service, and that field in itself was sort of a peculiar training field. The Indian Civil Service, for the younger amongst you, it will not be familiar maybe, was a very elitist administrative service in India. In England, they trained their top administrative people, and of course many were English, but they also trained many Indians for this service. And while today maybe heaven on earth for an Indian would be to work in an international organization, like the UN or something like that, at that time working in the Indian Civil Service was a wonderful thing because it was very selective. They only picked very few of the graduates of that program in Cambridge and other, I think also in Oxford, and very few of them got a posting then. My father happened to be amongst those very few, and he did get a posting, but as some of you may know, he turned it down. And of course, for his parents, I'm sure this was a somewhat not welcome and maybe insane attitude, but they had to go along with it. Insane for the simple reason to send the son abroad to study in England was very expensive. And to have him turn down a job which was well paid, highly respected, and a wonderful career perspective must have seemed rather crazy. Crazy young chap, as some of the young people in the eyes of their parents must have been crazy. But many of the other young Indians were quite enthusiastic, because what was the reason why he turned it down? As an officer of the Indian Civil Service, he sort of had to take the position of the British, sort of to downgrade and to rule over his own people. And this is what he did not want to. He did not want to be a part in leading a life like that, because already at that age, he was around 20, he wanted to work for his country's independence and not for the suppression of his countrymen. So being a student going abroad was one experience, but it was also tied in very much with not being an Englishman being there, even though his clothes were English when he studied at Cambridge, but his being an Indian. So for some of you, for the students, it will be similar. You will also come here and feel Indian and not German. Whereas if people have lived here for 30 years or 40 years or something, it will be a bit of both. It will be being Indian, of course, but also being German. And for me, it was always rather ununderstandable why some countries, Germany amongst those, had such a hang-up about dual nationality. Of course, there was one historic reason that people did, in case of a war, people wanted to have a clear-cut allegiance to one country, say for the soldiers and so on. But particularly in Europe, where there had been a long period of peace, it made very little sense, because if you look at yourself, maybe some of the Indians are German citizens, so you are really technically German, and of course by birth you are also technically Indian. But this will not make you fully Indian, it will not make you fully German. You will have an allegiance to both these countries. And this is the same way I feel. My father was Indian, so I have an allegiance to India. I grew up in Austria, I have an allegiance to Austria. I lived in the United States for 8 years, so I have a lot of sympathy for that country as well, though not the politics today so much. And in a way, I think living between cultures, between values sometimes should be a very valuable thing, even though it's not always quite simple. And it's not a question of sort of giving up one and assimilating the other completely or whatever. I sometimes quote a colleague of my husband's in the United States. He was from Norway. And he said, once you go abroad, in the beginning you say it's good or bad, it's my country, meaning the country of origin. But then if you live there for a while, then you say, good or bad, it's me. In a way, it's your own identity, which encompasses all these cultures and which I think enriches us. So my father did go abroad again. But again, he did not go abroad to emigrate. He went abroad partly because he was forced to, because he was in jail and they were willing to release him from jail on the condition that he would go abroad because he was sick and was seeking medical treatment in Vienna. It was my luck because if he hadn't gone there, he would not have met my mother and I would never have been. So I'm very grateful for this development. And of course, living in Austria at that time was a different thing in Austria and Europe, I must say, because he traveled a lot also. He did go there as an Indian. He did not go there to become an Austrian or a German or whatever. In his emigration, it was always the allegiance to his country which stayed there, which in some way or the other, in a more formal or less formal sense, made him an ambassador of his country. And looking at most of us, if we go abroad, if we live somewhere else, we always stay part of what we wear. And partly we are always ambassadors of our country or countries. And in that sense, I think there's something in common. But on the other hand, say if you go abroad and you live here for a long time, you work here, you also do so with the intention of making this your home. Whether your only home, or your temporary home, or your permanent home is a different matter. Now, the way my father had to go abroad, his home was always India. And he was, in a way, he was going abroad as an exile, in some ways. Of course, not to get medical treatment, that was a different matter. Then later on, when he came to Europe, during the Second World War, he was something like a refugee. A group of people who are with whom we are very familiar right now. In a way, he also took a similar path as some refugees take nowadays. He traveled across India. He went up to Peshawar, which is now Pakistan. That was one India, and took the trip to Kabul, which was also not very simple. And if we talk to refugees nowadays, how did you come? We know that these tours are not very simple and not without danger. Then he went over the mountains into the then Soviet Union, which is, I'm not sure which stan right now. There are several of the states which were once part of the Soviet Union, and Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, I'm not sure which one of those exactly was that part where he went to. And that was a very dangerous and unpleasant trip too. Anyway, it was in a way a trip as a refugee. Then when he came to, let's say, well, I skip over the part of in between, otherwise Dr. Kuhlmann is going to criticize me for being incorrect and too long. Anyway, when he came to Germany, he came here in a way as a refugee, but compared to, say, many refugees today, he was, of course, treated with a good amount of respect, and he was provided much better than our refugees today, because in a way he was again the ambassador of his country. I mean, there are self-interests involved too, no doubt, but it's again this wandering between the cultures, but for him it was always wandering as an Indian. And in a way it was probably tragic in his life that he had to go abroad so often, because he was quoted by the gentleman who accompanied him on the submarine going from Germany to the Far East, said, what would be the most terrible thing for you? And he said, being an exile. So in a way he was an exile for a long time, but some of you, and I personally believe that his being an exile, particularly also in the Far East, of leading an armed battle against the British for India's independence, even though it was militarily and strategically speaking not successful. Eventually was successful on the basis of a, well, what you might say today would be a war of the media, because once the Indian National Army's activities became known in India, which they were not before. It was also not known, for example, that the Indian provisional government wanted to send food relief to Bengal during the Bengal famine in the 1940s, because media at that time could sort of be manipulated much better than can be today. Today over Twitter and Facebook you would know these things immediately. Anyway, that was suppressed, but once the Indian public learned about the role of the INA, there was a certain pride in this battle, and this, according to documents which were opened later, not very recently, long ago, but showed that they did have a certain impact on Britain agreeing to granting independence to India. It was not the only factor. But anyway, what I wish to sort of remind you of, that not only you are wandering between the cultures and the countries, my father was too, and even though the roles that you play, that he played, that I played, were different, I think it is, of course, in my father's case, was a very necessary and I think valuable contribution to India. Maybe in our situation it's a valuable contribution to ourselves and to our environment. And I do hope that living here, whether for a long time or short time, you will find this a home. You will at the same time be ambassadors between the different cultures and nations, and that you will also enrich your own life by that. And particularly as in the present environment that we have here, which is sort of very ambivalent. On the other hand, we have a large number of people who are outgoing to newcomers, to refugees. At the same time, we have a resurgence of anti-foreigners, racist, etc. attitudes. I think in that situation, I think we should become aware of and be proud of the positive side of that. Jai Hind.